Chapter 1, Introduction to Comparative Government and Politics, a Conceptual Approach. Comparative government and politics provides an introduction to the wide, diverse world of governments and political practices that exist in modern times. Although the course focuses on specific countries, it also emphasizes an understanding of conceptual tools and methods that form a framework for comparing almost any governments that exist today. Additionally, it requires students to go beyond individual political systems to consider international forces that affect all people in the world, often in very different ways. 6 countries form the core of the course: Great Britain, Russia, China, Mexico, Iran, and Nigeria. The countries are chosen to reflect regional variations, but more importantly, to illustrate how important concepts operate both similarly and differently in different types of political systems. Advanced democracies, communist and post-communist countries, and newly industrialized and less developed nations. This book includes review material for all 6 countries. Goals for the course include gaining an understanding of major comparative political concepts, themes, and trends, knowing important facts about government and politics in Great Britain, Russia, China, Mexico, Iran, and Nigeria, identifying patterns of political processes and behavior and analyzing their political and economic consequences, comparing and contrasting political institutions and processes across countries, analyzing and interpreting basic data for comparing political systems. What is comparative government and politics? Most people understand that the term government is a reference to the leadership institutions that make policy decisions for a country. However, what exactly is politics? Politics is basically all about power. Who has the power to make the decisions? How did power holders get power? What challenges do leaders face from others, both inside and outside the country's borders, in keeping power? So, as we look at different countries, we are not only concerned about the ins and outs of how the government works, we also look at how power is gained, managed, challenged, and maintained. College-level courses in comparative government and politics vary in style and organization, but they all cover topics that enable meaningful comparisons across countries. These topics are introduced in the pages that follow and will be addressed in greater depth when each of the countries is covered separately. The topics are the comparative method, sovereignty, authority, and power, political and economic change, citizens, society, and the state, political institutions, and public policy. Topic 1. The comparative method. Political scientists sometimes argue about exactly what countries should be studied and how they should be compared. One approach is to emphasize empirical data based on factual statements and statistics, and another is to focus on normative issues that require value judgments. For example, the first approach might compare statistics that reflect economic development of a group of countries, including information about gross national product, per capita income, and amounts of imports and exports. The second approach builds on those facts to focus instead on whether or not the statistics bode well or ill for the countries. Empiricists might claim that it is not the role of political scientists to make such judgments, and their critics would imply that the empirical approach alone leads to a meaningless data collection. The approaches give us different but equally important tools for analyzing and comparing political systems. As with research in any social science, comparative government and politics relies on scientific methods to objectively and logically evaluate data. After reviewing earlier research, researchers formulate a hypothesis, a speculative statement about the relationship between 2 or more factors known as variables. Variables are measurable traits or characteristics that change under different conditions. For example, the poverty level in a country may change over time. One question that a comparative researcher might ask is, why are poverty rates higher in one country than in others? In seeking to answer this question, the researchers want to identify which variable or variables may contribute to high levels of poverty. In other words, the researcher is trying to discover causation, the idea that one or more variable causes or influences another. So a credible hypothesis might be that higher poverty levels are caused by lower levels of formal education. In this hypothesis, one variable, the poverty level, is called the dependent variable because it is caused or influenced by another variable, the level of formal education, which is called the independent variable. A correlation exists when a change in one variable coincides with a change in the other. Correlations are an indication that causality may be present. They do not necessarily indicate causation. Comparative researchers seek to identify the causal link between variables by collecting and analyzing data. How do we go about comparing countries? The model most frequently used until the early 1990s was the three-world approach, largely based on Cold War politics. The three worlds were 1. The United States and its allies, 2. The Soviet Union and its allies, and 3. Third world nations that did not fit into the first two categories and were economically underdeveloped and deprived. Even though the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, this approach is still taken today by many comparative textbooks, whose comparisons are based on democracy versus authoritarianism and communism versus capitalism. Even though this method is still valid, newer types of comparisons between countries are reflected in the following three trends. The impact of informal politics. Governments have formal positions and structures that may be seen on an organizational chart, but these formal elements are not all that there is to political systems. For example, in formal terms, Great Britain is led by a Prime Minister and has a House of Lords and a House of Commons. In comparison, the United States has a President, a Senate, and a House of Representatives. You may directly compare the responsibilities and typical activities of each position or structure in Britain to its counterpart in the United States. However, you gain a deeper understanding of both political systems if you connect civil society, the way that citizens organize and define themselves and their interests, to the ways that the formal government operates. Informal politics takes into consideration not only the ways that politicians operate outside their formal powers, but also the impact that beliefs, values, and actions of ordinary citizens have on policymaking. The importance of political change. One reason that the three-world approach has become more problematic in recent years is that the nature of world politics has changed. Since 1991, the world no longer has been dominated by two superpowers, and that fact has had consequences that have reverberated in many areas that no one could have predicted. However, it creates an opportunity to compare the impact of change on many different countries. The integration of political and economic systems. Even though we may theoretically separate government and politics from the economy, the two are often intertwined almost inextricably. For example, communism and capitalism are theoretical economic systems. But how do they truly separate them from government and politics? Attitudes and behavior of citizens are affected in many ways by economic inefficiency, economic inequality, and economic decision-making. If citizens turn to the government for solutions to economic problems and the government does not respond, they may revolt or take other actions that demand attention from the political elite. Keeping these trends in mind, in this book we will study countries in three different groups that are in some way similar in their political and economic institutions and practices. These groups are advanced democracies. These countries have well-established democratic governments and a high level of economic development. Of the 6 core countries we study in this course, Great Britain represents this group. Communist and post-communist countries. These countries have sought to create a system that limits individual freedoms in order to divide wealth more equally. Communism flourished during the 20th century, but lost ground to democratic regimes by the beginning of the 21st century. Russia, as a post-communist country, and China, currently a communist country, represent this group in our study of comparative government and politics. Less developed and newly industrializing countries. We will divide the countries traditionally referred to as the Third World into 2 groups, still very diverse within categories. The newly industrializing countries are experiencing rapid economic growth and also have shown a tendency toward democratization and political and social stability. Mexico and Iran represent this group, although, as you will see, Iran has many characteristics that make it difficult to categorize as one or the other. Less developed countries lack significant economic development, and they also tend to have authoritarian governments. Nigeria represents this group, although it has shown some signs of democratization in very recent years. Important concepts that enable meaningful comparisons among countries are introduced in this chapter, and will be addressed with each of the individual countries separately. However, it is important to remember that the main point of comparative government and politics is to use the categories to compare among countries. For example, never take the approach of, here's Britain, here's Russia, without noting what similarities and differences exist between the two countries.